Welcome, dreamer. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into rest, I want to take just a moment to thank you for being here. If you enjoy these calming sleep stories and they help bring peace to your nights, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone you care about. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing for all who need it. Now, let's settle in. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Let the day begin to melt away. You're safe here. You're held. And you don't have to do anything except relax. Tonight, we'll drift into a world where starlight dances across a quiet lake, where the air is cool and clean, and the only sound is the soft ripple of water beneath your boat. With every breath, we'll go deeper into stillness, gently floating, gently dreaming. Let's begin tonight's bedtime stories. "I remember," said Mrs. Over-the-Way. "Old as I am, I remember distinctly many of the unrecognized vexations, longings, and disappointments of childhood. By unrecognized, I mean those vexations, longings, and disappointments which could not be understood by nurses, are not confided even to mothers, and through which, even in our cradles, we become subject to that law of humanity which gives to every heart its own secret bitterness to be endured alone. These are they which sometimes outlive weightier memories and produce lifelong impressions disproportionate to their value, but oftener, perhaps, are washed away by the advancing tide of time, the vexations, longings, and disappointments of the next period of our lives. These are they which are apt to be forgotten too soon to benefit our children, and which in the forgetting make childhood all bright to look back upon, and foster that happy fancy that there is one division of mortal life in which greedy desire, unfulfilled purpose, envy, sorrow, weariness, and satiety have no part, by which every man believes himself at least to have been happy as a child. My childhood, on the whole, was a very happy one. The story that I am about to relate is only a fragment of it. As I look into the fire, and the hot coals shape themselves into 1,000 memories of the past, I seem to be staring with childish eyes at a board that stares back at me out of a larch plantation and gives notice that this house is to let. Then, again, I seem to peep through rusty iron gates at the house itself, an old red house with large windows, through which one could see the white shutters that were always closed. To look at this house, though only with my mind's eye, recalls the feeling of mysterious interest with which I looked at it 50 years ago. and brings back the almost oppressive happiness of a certain day, when Sarah, having business with the couple who kept the empty manor, took me with her and left me to explore the grounds whilst she visited her friends. Next to a companion with that rare sympathy of mind to mind, that exceptional coincidence of tastes, which binds some few friendships in a chain of mesmeric links, supplanting all the complacencies of love by intuition, is a companion whose desires and occupations are in harmony, if not in unison, with one's own. That friend whom the long patience of the angler does not chafe, the protracted pleasures of the sketcher do not weary, because time flies as swiftly with him whilst he pores over his book, or devoutly seeks botanical specimens through the artist's middle distance. That friend, in short, that valuable friend, who is blessed with the great and good quality of writing a hobby of his own, and the greater and better quality of allowing other people to ride theirs. I did not think out all this 50 years ago. Neither were the tastes of that excellent housemaid Sarah quite on a level with those of which I have spoken. But I remember feeling the full comfort of the fact that Sarah's love for friendly gossip was quite as ardent as mine for romantic discovery, that she was disposed to linger quite as long to chat as I to explore, and that she no more expected me to sit wearily through her kitchen confidences than I imagined that she would give a long afternoon to sharing my daydreams in the gardens of the deserted manor. We had ridden our respective hobbies till nearly tea-time before she appeared. "I'm afraid you must be tired of waiting, Miss Mary," said she. "Tired," I exclaimed, "not in the least. I have been so happy, and I am so much obliged to you, Sarah. Need I say why I was so happy that afternoon? Surely most people have felt, at least in childhood, the fascination of deserted gardens, uninhabited houses, ruined churches. They have that advantage over what is familiar and in use that undiscovered regions have over the comfortable one that the traveler leaves to explore them, that the secret which does not concern me has over the facts which do, that what we wish for has over what we possess. If you, my dear, were to open one of those drawers and find nurse's Sunday dress folded up in the corner, it would hardly amuse you. But if instead thereof you found a dress with a long stiff bodice, square at the neck, and ruffled round the sleeves, such as you have seen in old pictures, no matter how old or useless it might be, it would shed round it an atmosphere of delightful and mysterious speculations. This curiosity, these fancies, roused by the ancient dress whose wearer has passed away, are awakened equally by empty houses where someone must once have lived, though his place knows him no more. It was so with the manor. How often had I peeped through the gates, catching sight of garden walks, and wondering whither they led, and who had walked in them, seeing that the shutters behind one window were partly open, and longing to look in. Today I had been in the walks and peeped through the window. This was the happiness. Through the window I had seen a large hall with a marble floor and broad stone stairs winding upwards into unknown regions. By the walks I had arrived at the locked door of the kitchen garden, at a small wood or wilderness of endless delights, including a broken swing, and at a dilapidated summer house. I had wandered over the spongy lawn, which was cut into a long green promenade by high-clipped yew hedges, walking between which, in olden times, the ladies grew erect and stately, as plants among brushwood stretch up to air and light. Finally, I had brought away such relics as it seemed to me that honesty would allow. I had found half a rusty pair of scissors in the summer house. Perhaps some fair lady of former days had lost them here, and swept distractedly up and down the long walks seeking them. Perhaps they were a present, and she had given a luck penny for them, lest they should cut love. Sarah said the housekeeper might have dropped them there, but Sarah was not a person of sentiment. I did not show her the marble I found by the hedge, the acorn I picked up in the park, nor a puny pansy which, halfway back to a wild heartsease, had touched me as a pathetic memorial of better days. When I got home, I put the scissors, the marble, and the pansy into a box. The acorn I hung in a bottle of water. It was to be an oak tree. Properly speaking, I was not at home just then, but on a visit to my grandmother and a married aunt without children who lived with her. A fever had broken out in my own home, and my visit here had been prolonged to keep me out of the way of infection. I was very happy and comfortable except for one single vexation, which was this. I slept on a little bed in what had once been the nursery, a large room which was now used as a workroom. A great deal of sewing was done in my grandmother's house, and the sewing maid and at least one other of the servants sat there every evening. A red silk screen was put before my bed to shield me from the candlelight, and I was supposed to be asleep when they came upstairs. But I never remember to have been otherwise than wide awake, nervously awake, wearily awake. This was the vexation. I was not a strong child and had a very excitable brain, and the torture that it was to hear those maids gossiping on the other side of the dim red light of my screen I cannot well describe, but I do most distinctly remember. I tossed till the clothes got hot, and threw them off till I got cold, and stopped my ears, and pulled the sheet over my face, and tried not to listen, and listened in spite of all. They told long stories, and made many jokes that I couldn't understand. Sometimes I heard names that I knew, and fancied I had learnt some wonderful secret. Sometimes, on the contrary, I made noises to intimate that I was awake, when one of them would rearrange my glaring screen and advise me to go to sleep. And then they talked in whispers, which was more distracting still. One evening, some months after my ramble round the manor, the maids went out to tea, and I lay in peaceful silence watching the shadows which crept noiselessly about the room as the fire blazed, and wishing Sarah and her colleagues nothing less than a month of uninterrupted tea parties. I was almost asleep when Aunt Harriet came into the room. She brought a candle, put up my screen, the red screen again, and went to the work table. She had not been rustling with the work things for many minutes when my grandmother followed her and shut the door with an air which seemed to promise a long stay. She also gave a shove to my screen, and then the following conversation began. "I have been to Lady Sutfield's today, Harriet." "Indeed, ma'am." But my aunt respectfully continued her work, as I could hear by the scraping of the scissors along the table. "I heard some news there. The manor is let." I almost jumped in my bed, and Aunt Harriet's scissors paused. "Let, ma'am, to whom?" "To a Mrs. Moss. You must have heard me speak of her. I knew her years ago when we were both young women. Anastasia Eden she was then." I could hear my aunt move to the fire and sit down. "The beautiful Miss Eden? Whom did she marry at last? Was there not some love affair of hers that you knew about?" "Her love affairs were endless. But you mean Mr. Sandford. She treated him very ill, very ill." There was a pause while the fire crackled in the silence, and then, to the infinite satisfaction of my curiosity, Aunt Harriet said, "I've forgotten the story, ma'am. He was poor, was he not?" "He had quite enough to marry on," my grandmother answered energetically. "But he was not a great match. It was an old story, my dear. The world, the world, the world. I remember sitting up with Anastasia after a ball, where he had been at her side all the evening. We sipped hot posset and talked of our partners. Ah, dear." And here my grandmother heaved a sigh, partly perhaps because of the follies of youth, and partly perhaps because youth had gone and could come back no more. "Anastasia talked of him," she continued. "I remember her asking me if her man were not a pretty fellow, and if he had not sweet blue eyes and the greatest simplicity I ever knew but in a child. It was true enough, and he was a great deal more than that, a great deal more than she ever understood. Poor Anastasia. I advised her to marry him, but she seemed to look on that as impossible. I remember her saying that it would be different if she were not an acknowledged beauty, but it was expected that she would marry well, and he was comparatively poor and not even singular. He was accomplished, and the soul of honor, but simple, provokingly simple, with no pretensions to carry off the toast of a county. My dear, if he had been notorious in any way, for dissipation, for brawling, for extravagance, I believe it would have satisfied the gaping world, and he would have had a chance. But there was nothing to talk about, and Anastasia had not the courage to take him for himself. She had the world at her feet, and paid for it by being bound by its opinion. Here my grandmother, who was apt to moralize, especially when relating biographies of young ladies, gave another sigh. "Then why did she encourage him?" inquired Aunt Harriet. who also moralized, but with more of indignation and less of philosophy. I believe she loved him in spite of herself, but at the last, when he offered, she turned prudent and refused him. Poor man! Did he ever marry? Yes, and very happily. A charming woman. But the strange part of the story is that he came quite unexpectedly into a large property that was in his family. Did he? Then he would have been as good a match as most of her admirers. Better, it was a fine estate. Poor Anastasia. Serve her right, said my aunt shortly. She was very beautiful, my grandmother gently recommenced. She said this, not precisely as an excuse, but with something of the sort in her tone. Very beautiful. How stately she did look that night, to be sure. She did not paint, and her complexion, a shade too high by day, was perfection by candlelight. I can see her now, my dear, as she stood up for a minuet with him. We wore hoops then, and she had a white brocade petticoat embroidered with pink rosebuds, and a train and bodice of pea-green satin, and green satin shoes with pink heels. You never saw anything more lovely than that brocade. A rich old aunt had given it to her. The shades of the rosebuds were exquisite. I embroidered the rosebuds on that salmon-colored cushion downstairs from a piece that Anastasia gave me as a pattern. Dear me, what a dress it was, and how lovely she looked in it. Her eyes were black, a thing you rarely see, and they shone and glittered under her powdered hair. She had a delicately curved nose, splendid teeth, too, and showed them when she smiled. Then such a lovely throat and beautifully shaped arms. I don't know how it is, my dear Harriet, added my grandmother thoughtfully, but you don't see the splendid women nowadays that there were when I was young. There are plenty of pretty, lively girls, rather too lively in my old-fashioned judgment, but not the real stately beauty that it was worth a 20-mile drive there and back, just to see at one of the old county balls. My aunt sniffed, partly from a depressing consciousness of being one of a degenerate generation, and of a limited experience in the matter of county balls, partly also to express her conviction that principle is above beauty. She said, "Then Miss Eden married, ma'am?" "Yes, rather late, Mr. Moss, a wealthy Indian merchant, I believe. She lost all her children, I know, one after another, and then he died. Poor Anastasia, it seems like yesterday, and to think she should be coming here." My grandmother sighed again, and I held my breath, hoping for some further particulars of the lovely heroine of this romance. But I was disappointed. My uncle's voice at this moment called loudly from below, and Aunt Harriet hurried off with a conscious meritoriousness about her, becoming a lady who had married the right man, and took great care of him. "Supper, ma'am, I think," she said as she left the room. My grandmother sat still by the fire, sighing gently now and then, and I lay making up my mind to brave all and tell her that I was awake. In the first place, although I was not intentionally eavesdropping, and my being awake was certainly not my fault, I felt rather uneasy at having overheard what I knew was not intended for my hearing. Besides this, I wanted to hear some more stories of the lovely Mrs. Moss, and to ask how soon she would come to the manor. After a few seconds, my grandmother rose and toddled across the room. I made an effort and spoke just above my breath. "Granny," but my grandmother was rather deaf. Moreover, my voice may have been drowned in the heavy sigh with which she closed the nursery door. The room was empty again. The glare of the red screen was tenderly subdued in the firelight. But for all this, I did not go to sleep. I took advantage of my freedom to sit up in bed, toss my hair from my forehead, and clasping my knees with my arms to rock myself and think. My thoughts had one object. My whole mind was filled with one image, Mrs. Moss. The future inhabitant of my dear deserted manor would, in any circumstances, have been an interesting subject for my fancies. The favored individual whose daily walk might be between the yew hedges on that elastic lawn, who should eat, drink, and sleep through the commonplace hours of this present time behind those mystical white shutters. But when the individual added to this felicitous dispensation of fortune the personal attributes of unparalleled beauty and pea-green satin, of having worn hoops, high heels, and powder, of countless lovers and white brocade with pink rosebuds, well might I sit, my brain whirling with anticipation as I thought, "She is coming here, I shall see her." For though, of course, I knew that having lived in those, so to speak, prehistoric times when my grandmother was young, Mrs. Moss must now be an old woman. Yet, strange as it may seem, my dear, I do assure you that I never realized the fact. I thought of her as I had heard of her, young and beautiful, and modeled my hopes accordingly. Most people's daydreams take sooner or later a selfish turn. I seem to identify myself with the beautiful Anastasia. I thought of the ball as one looks back to the past. I fancied myself moving through the minuet de la cour, whose stately paces scarcely made the silken rosebuds rustle. I rejected en masse countless suitors of fabulous wealth and nobility, but when it came to Mr. Sandford, I could feel with Miss Eden no more. My grandmother had said that she loved him, that she encouraged him, and that she gave him up for money. It was a mystery. In her place, I thought, I would have danced every dance with him. I would have knitted for him in winter and gathered flowers for him in the summer hedges. To whom should one be most kind, if not to those whom one most loves? To love and take pleasure in giving pain, to balance a true heart and clear blue eyes against money and prefer money, was not at that time comprehensible by me. I pondered and, so to speak, spread out the subject before my mind and sat in judgment upon it. Money, that is, golden guineas, my grandmother had given me one on my birthday. Crowns, shillings, sixpences, pennies, halfpennies, farthings, And when you come to consider how many things a guinea judiciously expended in a toy shop will procure, you see that money is a great thing, especially if you have the full control of it and are not obliged to spend it on anything useful. On the other hand, those whom you love and who love you, not in childhood, thank God, the smallest part of one's acquaintance. I made a list on my own account. It began with my mother and ended with my yellow cat. It included a crusty old gardener who was at times, especially in the spring, so particularly cross that I might have been tempted to exchange him for the undisputed possession of that stock of seeds, tools, and flower pots which formed our chief subject of dispute. But this is a digression. I took the lowest. Could I part with Sandy Tom for any money, or for anything that money could buy? I thought of a speaking doll, a miniature piano, a tiny carriage drawn by 4 yellow mastiffs, of a fairy purse that should never be empty, with all that might thereby be given to others or kept for oneself. And then I thought of Sandy Tom, of his large, round, soft head, his fine eyes. They were yellow, not blue, and glared with infinite tenderness, his melodious purr, his expressive whiskers, his incomparable tail. Love rose up as an impulse, an instinct. It would not be doubted, it utterly refused to be spread out to question. Oh, puss, I thought, if you could but leap onto the bed at this moment, I would explain it all to our mutual comprehension and satisfaction. My dear Sandy, I would say, with you to lie on the cushioned seat, a nice little carriage and 4 yellow mastiffs would be perfection. But as to comparing what I love, to wit, you, Sandy, with what I want, to wit, 4 yellow mastiffs and a great many other things besides, I should as soon think of cutting off your tail to dust the doll's house with. Alas, Sandy Tom was at home. I could only imagine the gentle rub of the head with which he would have assented. Meanwhile, I made up my mind firmly on one point. My grandmother was wrong. Miss Anastasia Eden had not loved Mr. Sanford. Smash! The fire, which had been gradually becoming hollow, fell in at this moment, and I started to find myself chilly and cramped, and so lay down. Then my thoughts took another turn. I wondered if I should grow up beautiful, like Mrs. Moss. It was a serious question. I had often looked at myself in the glass, but I had a general idea that I looked much like other little girls of my age. I began gravely to examine myself in detail, beginning from the top of my head. My hair was light and cropped on a level with the lobes of my ears. This, however, would amend itself with time, and I had long intended that my hair should be of raven blackness and touch the ground at least. But that will not be till I am grown up, thought I. Then my eyes, they were large. In fact, the undue proportions they assumed when I looked ill or tired formed a family joke. If size were all that one requires in eyes, mine would certainly pass muster. Moreover, they had long, curly lashes. I fingered these slowly and thought of Sandy's whiskers. At this point, I nearly fell asleep, but roused myself to examine my nose. My grandmother had said that Mrs. Moss's nose was delicately curved. Now, it is certainly true that a curve may be either concave or convex, but I had heard of the bridge of a nose, and knew well enough which way the curve should go, and I had a shrewd suspicion that if so very short a nose as mine, with so much and so round a tip, could be said to be curved at all, the curve went the wrong way. At the same time, I could not feel sure. For I must tell you that to lie in a comfortable bed, at an hour long beyond the time when one ought naturally to be asleep and to stroke one's nose, is a proceeding not favorable to forming a clear judgment on so important a point as one's personal appearance. The very shadows were still as well as silent. The fire had ceased to flicker. A delicious quietude pervaded the room as I stroked my nose and dozed and stroked my nose, and lost all sense of its shape, and fancied it a huge lump growing under my fingers. The extreme unpleasantness of this idea just prevented my falling asleep, and I roused myself and sat up again. It's no use feeling, I thought. I'll look in the glass. There was one mirror in the room. It hung above the mantelpiece. It was old, deeply framed in dark wood, and was so hung as to slope forwards into the room. In front of the fire stood an old-fashioned cushioned armchair, with a very high back and a many-frilled chintz cover. A footstool lay near it. It was here that my grandmother had been sitting. I jumped out of bed, put the footstool into the chair that I might get to a level with the glass, and climbed onto it. Thanks to the slope of the mirror, I could now see my reflection as well as the dim firelight would permit. What a silly child, you will say, Ida. Very silly indeed, my dear. And how one remembers one's follies. At the end of half a century, I recall my reflection in that old nursery mirror more clearly than I remember how I looked in the glass before which I put on my bonnet this evening to come to tea with you. The weird, startled glance of my eyes which, in their most prominent stage of weariness, gazed at me out of the shadows of the looking-glass, the tumbled tufts of hair, the ghostly effect of my white nightdress. As to my nose, I could absolutely see nothing of its shape. The firelight just caught the round tip, which shone like a little white toadstool from the gloom, and this was all. One can't see the shape, full face, I thought. If I had only another looking-glass. But there was not another. I knew it, and yet involuntarily looked round the room. Suddenly I exclaimed aloud, "Mr. Joseph will do." Who was Mr. Joseph, you will ask? My dear Ida, I really do not know. I have not the least idea. I had heard him called Mr. Joseph, and I fancy he was a connection of the family. All I knew of him was his portrait, a silhouette, elegantly glazed and framed in black wood, which hung against the nursery wall. I was ignorant of his surname and history. I had never examined his features, but I knew that happily he had been very stout, since his ample coat and waistcoat, cut out in black paper, converted the glass which covered them into an excellent mirror for my dolls. Worthy Mr. Joseph, here he was coming in useful again. How much we owe to our forefathers! I soon unhooked him, and climbing back into the chair, commenced an examination of my profile by the process of double reflection, but all in vain. Whether owing to the dusty state of the mirror, or to the dim light, or to the unobliging shapeliness of Mr. Joseph's person, I cannot say, but turn and twist as I would, I could not get a view of my profile sufficiently clear and complete to form a correct judgment upon. I held Mr. Joseph, now high, now low. I stooped, I stood on tiptoe, I moved forward, I leant backward. It was this latest maneuver that aggravated the natural top-heaviness of the chair and endangered its balance. The forelegs rose. My spasmodic struggle was made in the wrong direction, and I, the armchair, and Mr. Joseph fell backwards together. Two of us were light enough, and happily escaped unhurt. It was the armchair which fell with such an appalling crash, and whether it were any the worse or no, I could not tell as it lay. As soon as I had a little recovered from the shock, therefore, I struggled to raise it, whilst Mr. Joseph lay helplessly upon the ground, with his waistcoat turned up to the ceiling. It was thus that my aunt found us. If only Mr. Joseph and I had fallen together, no one need have been the wiser. But that lumbering armchair had come down with a bump that startled the sober trio at supper in the dining-room below. "What is the matter?" said Aunt Harriet. I was speechless. "What have you been doing?" I couldn't speak, but accumulating misfortune was gradually overpowering me, and I began to cry. "Get into bed," said Aunt Harriet. I willingly obeyed, and Aunt Harriet seated herself at the foot. "Now, think before you speak, Mary," she said quietly, "and then tell me the truth. What have you been doing?" One large tear rolled over my nose and off the tip as I feebly began. I got into the chair. "Well?" said Aunt Harriet. "To look in the glass." "What for?" said Aunt Harriet. Tears flowed unrestrainedly over my face as I howled in self-abasement. To look at the shape of my nose. At this point Aunt Harriet rose and, turning her back rather abruptly, crossed the room and picked up Mr. Joseph. I have since had reason to believe that she was with difficulty concealing a fit of laughter. "What have you had this picture down for?" she inquired, still with her back to me. "I couldn't see," I sobbed, "and I got Mr. Joseph to help me." My aunt made no reply, and, still carefully concealing her face, restored Mr. Joseph to his brass nail with great deliberation. "There is nothing like full confession." I broke the silence. Aunt Harriet, I was awake when you and Granny were here and heard what you said. You are a very silly, naughty child, my aunt severely returned. Why don't you go to sleep when you are sent to bed? I can't, I sobbed, with talking and candles. You've got the screen, said Aunt Harriet, and I cannot tell why, but somehow I lacked courage to say that the red screen was the chief instrument of torture. Well, go to sleep now, she concluded, and be thankful you're not hurt. You might have killed yourself. Encouraged by the gracious manner in which she tucked me up, I took a shortcut to the information which I had failed to attain through Mr. Joseph. Aunt Harriet, I said, do you think I shall ever be as beautiful as Mrs. Moss? I'm ashamed of you, said Aunt Harriet. I climbed no more into the treacherous armchair. I eschewed the mirror. I left Mr. Joseph in peace upon the wall. I took no further trouble about the future prospects of my nose. But night and day I thought of Mrs. Moss. I found the old cushion and sat by it, gazing at the faded tints of the rosebuds, till I imagined the stiff brocade in all its beauty and freshness. I took a vigorous drawing fit, but it was only to fill my little book with innumerable sketches of Mrs. Moss. My uncle lent me his paint box, as he was wont, and if the fancy portraits that I made were not satisfactory even to myself, they failed in spite of cheeks blushing with vermilion, in spite of eyes as large and brilliant as lamp-black could make them, and in spite of the most accurately curved noses that my pencil could produce. The amount of gamboge and Prussian blue that I wasted in vain efforts to produce a satisfactory pea green leaves me at this day an astonished admirer of my uncle's patience. At this time I wished to walk along no other road than that which led to my dear manor, where the iron gates were being painted, the garden made tidy, and the shutters opened. But above all, the chief object of my desires was to accompany my grandmother and aunt in their first visit to Mrs. Moss. Once I petitioned Aunt Harriet on this subject. Her answer was, "My dear, there would be nothing to amuse you. Mrs. Moss is an old woman." Granny said she was so beautiful, I suggested. So she was, my dear, when your grandmother was young. These and similar remarks I heard and heeded not. They did not add one wrinkle to my ideal of Mrs. Moss. They in no way whatever lessened my desire of seeing her. I had never seen my grandmother young, and her having ever been so seemed to me at the most a matter of tradition. On the other hand, Mrs. Moss had been presented to my imagination in the bloom of youth and beauty, and, say what they would, in the bloom of youth and beauty I expected to see her still. One afternoon, about a week after the arrival of Mrs. Moss, I was busy in the garden, where I had been working for an hour or more, when I heard carriage wheels drive up and stop at our door. Could it be Mrs. Moss? I stole gently round to a position where I could see without being seen, and discovered that the carriage was not that of any caller, but my uncle's. Then Granny and Aunt Harriet were going out. I rushed up to the coachman and asked where they were going. He seemed in no way overpowered by having to reply, "To the manor, miss." That was to Mrs. Moss, and I was to be left behind. I stood speechless in bitter disappointment as my grandmother rustled out in her best silk dress, followed by Aunt Harriet and my uncle, who, when he saw me, exclaimed, "Why, there's my little Mary! Why don't you take her? I'll be bound she wants to go." "I do indeed," I exclaimed in Cinderella-like tones. "But Mrs. Moss is such an old lady," said Aunt Harriet, whose ideas upon children were purely theoretical, and who could imagine no interests for them apart from other children, from toys or definite amusements. What could the child do with herself? "Do," said my uncle, who took a rough and cheery view of life. "Why, look about her to be sure. And if Mrs. M is an old lady, there'll be all the more Indian cabinets and screens and Japan tables and knickknacks and lapdogs. Keep your eyes open, Miss Mary. I've never seen the good lady or her belongings, but I'll stake my best hat on the Japan ware and the lapdog. Now, how soon can you be dressed?" Later in life, the selfish element mixes more largely with our admirations. A few years thence, and in a first interview with the object of so many fancies, I should have thought as much of my own appearance on the occasion as of what I was myself to see. I should have taken some pains with my toilette. At that time, the desire to see Mrs. Moss was too absorbing to admit of any purely personal considerations. I dashed into the nursery, scrubbed my hands and face to a raw red complexion, brushed my hair in 3 strokes, and secured my things with one sweep. I hastily pocketed a pincushion of red cloth, worked with yellow silk spots in the likeness of a strawberry. It was a pet treasure of mine, and I intended it as an offering to Mrs. Moss. I tied my hood at the top of the stairs, fastened my tippet in the hall, and reached the family coach by about 3 of those bounds common to all young animals. "Hullo!" said my uncle, with his face through the carriage door. "You've not thanked me yet." I flung my arms round his starched neckcloth. "You're a darling!" I exclaimed with an emphatic squeeze. "You're another," he replied, returning the embrace upon my hood. With this mutual understanding we parted, and I thought that if Mrs. Moss were not certain to fulfill my ideal, I should have wished her to be as nearly like Uncle James as the circumstances of the case would permit. I watched his yellow waistcoat and waving hands till they could be seen no longer, and then I settled myself primly upon the back seat and ventured upon a shy, conciliating promise to be very good. "You're quite welcome to come, child," said Aunt Harriet, "but as I said, there are neither children nor playthings for you." Children or playthings, what did I want with either? I put my arm through the loop by the window and watched the fields as they came and vanished with vacant eyes, and thought of Mrs. Moss. A dozen times had I gone through the whole scene in my mind before we drove through the iron gates. I fancied myself in the bare, spacious hall at which I had peeped. I seemed to hear a light laugh, and to see the beautiful face of Mrs. Moss look over the banisters, to hear a rustle in the scraping of the stiff brocade as the pink rosebuds shimmered and the green satin shoes peeped out and tap, tap, tap. The high pink heels resounded from the shallow stairs. I had dreamed this daydream many times over before the carriage stopped with a shake, and Aunt Harriet roused me, asking if I were asleep. In another minute or so we were in the hall, and here I met with my first disappointment. To begin with, I had seen the hall unfurnished and had not imagined it otherwise. I had pictured Mrs. Moss in her beauty and rose brocade, the sole ornament of its cold emptiness. Then, though I knew that my grandmother and aunt must both be present, I had really fancied myself the chief character in this interview with Mrs. Moss. I had thought of myself as rushing up the stairs to meet her and laying the pincushion at her green satin feet. And now that at last I was really in the hall, I should not have known it again. It was carpeted from end to end. Fragrant orange trees stood in tubs, large hunting pictures hung upon the walls, below which stood cases of stuffed birds, and over all presided a footman in livery, who himself looked like a stuffed specimen of the human race with unusually bright plumage. No face peeped over the banisters, and when we went upstairs, the footman went first, as seemed due to him, then my grandmother, followed by my aunt, and lastly I, in the humblest insignificance behind them. My feet sank into the soft stair carpets. I vacantly admired the elegant luxury around me, with an odd sensation of heartache. Everything was beautiful, but I had wanted nothing to be beautiful but Mrs. Moss. Already the vision began to fade. That full-fed footman troubled my fancies. His scarlet plush killed the tender tints of the rosebuds in my thoughts, and the streaky powder upon his hair seemed a mockery of the toupee I hoped to see, whose whiteness should enhance the luster of rare black eyes. He opened the drawing-room door and announced my grandmother and aunt. I followed, and, so far as one may be said to face anything when one stands behind the skirts of two intervening elders, I was face to face with Mrs. Moss. That is, I was face to face with a tall, dark old woman with stooping shoulders, a hooked nose, black eyes that smoldered in their sunken sockets, and a distinct growth of beard upon her chin. Mr. Moss had been dead many years, and his widow had laid aside her weeds. She wore a dress of feuille morte satin and a black lace shawl. She had a rather elaborate cap with a tendency to get on one side, perhaps because it would not fit comfortably on the brown front with bunchy curls which was fastened into its place by a band of broad black velvet. And this was Mrs. Moss. This was the end of all my fancies. There was nothing astonishing in the disappointment. The only marvel was that I should have indulged in so foolish a fancy for so long. I had been told more than once that Mrs. Moss was nearly as old as my grandmother. As it was, she looked older. Why, I could not tell then, though I know now. My grandmother, though never a beauty, had a sweet smile of her own, and a certain occasional kindling of the eyes, the outward signs of a character full of sentiment and intelligence, and these had outlasted youth. She had always been what is called pleasing, and she was pleasing still. But in Mrs. Moss no strength, no sentiment, no intellect filled the place of the beauty that was gone. Features that were powerful without character, and eyes that glowed without expression, formed a wreck with little to recall the loveliness that had bewildered Mr. Sandford and me. There is not much more to tell, Ida. This was the disappointment. This is the cause of my dislike for a certain shade of foil mort satin. It disappointed me of that rose brocade which I was never to see. You shall hear how I got through the visit, however. This meeting, which, like so many meetings, had proved the very reverse of what was hoped. Through an angle of Aunt Harriet's pelisse, I watched the meeting between my grandmother and Mrs. Moss. They kissed and then drew back and looked at each other, still holding hands. I wondered if my grandmother felt as I felt. I could not tell. With one of her smiles, she bent forward and, kissing Mrs. Moss again, said, "God bless you, Anastasia. God bless you, Elizabeth." It was the first time Mrs. Moss had spoken, and her voice was rather gruff. Then both ladies sat down, and my grandmother drew out her pocket handkerchief and wiped her eyes. Mrs. Moss began, as I thought, to look for hers, and not finding it, called Metcalf, on which a faded little woman with a forefinger in a faded-looking book came out from behind some window curtains and, rummaging Mrs. Moss's chair with a practiced hand, produced a large silver snuff-box, from which Mrs. Moss took a pinch, and then offered it to Granny, who shook her head. Mrs. Moss took another and a larger pinch. It was evident what made her voice so gruff. Aunt Harriet was introduced as my daughter Harriet, and made a stiff curtsy as Mrs. Moss smiled and nodded and bade her, "Sit down, my dear." Throughout the whole interview she seemed to be looked upon by both ladies as a child, and played the part so well, sitting prim and silent on her chair, that I could hardly help humming as I looked at her. "Hold up your head, turn out your toes, speak when you're spoken to, mend your clothes." I was introduced, too, as a grandchild, made a curtsy the shadow of Aunt Harriet's, received a nod, the shadow of that bestowed upon her, and got out of the way as soon as I could behind my aunt's chair, where, coming unexpectedly upon 3 fat pug dogs on a mat, I sat down among them and felt quite at home. The sight of the pugs brought Uncle James to my mind, and when I looked round the room, it seemed to me that he must be a conjurer at least. So true was everything he had said. A large Indian screen hid the door. Japanned boxes stood on a little table to correspond in front of it, and there were two cabinets having shallow drawers with decorated handles and a great deal of glass, through which odd teacups, green dragons, Indian gods, and Dresden shepherdesses were visible upon the shelves. The room was filled with knick-knacks, and here were the pug dogs, no less than 3 of them. They were very fat, and had little beauty except as to their round heads and black wrinkled snouts, which I kissed over and over again. "Do you mind Mrs. Moss's being old and dressing in that hideous brown dress?" I asked in a whisper at the ear of one of these round heads. "Think of the rosebuds on the brocade, and the pea-green satin, and the high-heeled shoes." "Ah," I added, "you are only a pug, and pugs don't think." Nevertheless, I pulled out the pincushion and showed it to each dog in turn, and the sight of it so forcibly reminded me of my vain hopes that I could not help crying. A hot tear fell upon the nose of the oldest and fattest pug, which so offended him that he moved away to another mat at some distance, and as both the others fell fast asleep, I took refuge in my own thoughts. The question arose, why should not Mrs. Moss have the pincushion after all? I had expected her to be young and beautiful, and she had proved old and ugly, it is true. But there is no reason why old and ugly people should not have cushions to keep their pins in. It was a struggle to part with my dear strawberry pincushion in the circumstances, but I had fairly resolved to do so when the rustle of leave-taking began, and I had to come out of my corner. "Bid Mrs. Moss good day, Mary," said my grandmother, and added, "The child has been wild to come and see you, Anastasia." Mrs. Moss held out her hand good-naturedly. "So you wanted to see me, my dear," said she. I took my hand out of my pocket where I had been holding the pincushion and put both into Mrs. Moss's palm. "I brought this for you, ma'am," I said. "It is not a real strawberry. It is emery. I made it myself." And the fact of having sacrificed something for Mrs. Moss made me almost fond of her. Moreover, there was an expression in her eyes at that moment which gave them beauty. She looked at my grandmother and laid her hand on my head. "I lost all mine, Elizabeth." I thought she was speaking of her pincushions, and being in a generous mood, said hastily, "When that is worn out, ma'am, I will make you another." But she was speaking of her children. Poor Mrs. Moss. She took another huge pinch of snuff and called, "Metcalf." The faded little woman appeared once more. "I must give you a keepsake in return, my dear," said Mrs. Moss. "The china pug Metcalf." Metcalf, whose face always wore a smile that looked as if it were just about to disappear, and who, indeed, for that matter, always looked as if she were just about to disappear herself, opened one of the cabinets and brought out a little toy pug in china, very delicately colored, and looking just like one of my friends on the mat. I fell in love with it at once, and it was certainly a handsome exchange for the strawberry pincushion. "You will send the child to see me now and then, Elizabeth?" said Mrs. Moss as we retired. In the end, Mrs. Moss and I became great friends. I put aside my dream among the vain fancies of life and took very kindly to the manor in its new aspect. Even the stuffed footman became familiar and learnt to welcome me with a smile. The real Mrs. Moss was a more agreeable person than I have, I fear, represented her. She had failed to grasp solid happiness in life because she had chosen with the cowardice of an inferior mind. But she had borne disappointment with dignity and submitted to heavy sorrows with patience, and a greater nature could not have done more. She was the soul of good humor and the love of small chat, which contrasted so oddly with her fierce appearance, was a fund of entertainment for me, as I fed my imagination and stored my memory with anecdotes of the good old times and the many quiet evenings we spent together. I learnt to love her more heartily, I confess, when she bought a new gown and gave the fuel mort satin to Mrs. Metcalf. Mrs. Metcalf was humble companion to Mrs. Moss. She was in reality single, but she exacted the married title as a point of respect. At the beginning of our acquaintance I called her Miss Metcalf, and this occasioned the only check our friendship ever received. Now I would, with the greatest pleasure, have addressed her as my Lord Archbishop, or in any other style to which she was not entitled, it being a matter of profound indifference to me. But the question was a serious one to her, and very serious she made it, till I almost despaired of our ever coming to an understanding on the subject. On every other point she was unassuming almost to nonentity. She was weak-minded to the verge of mental palsy. She was more benevolent indeed, and more wandering in conversation than anyone I have met with since. That is, in ordinary life. In the greenhouse or garden, with which she and the head gardener alone had any real acquaintance, her accurate and profound knowledge would put to shame many professed garden botanists I have met with since. From her I learnt what little I know of the science of horticulture, and with her I spent many happy hours over the fine botanical works in the manor library, which she alone ever opened. And so I became reconciled to things as they were, though to this day I connect with that shade of foil mort satin a disappointment not to be forgotten. "It is a dull story, is it not, Ida?" said the little old lady, pausing here. She had not told it in precisely these words, but this was the sum and substance of it. Ida nodded. Not that she had thought the story dull, so far as she had heard it, and whilst she was awake, but she had fallen asleep, and so she nodded. Mrs. Overthaway looked back at the fire, to which, indeed, she had been talking for some time past. A child's story, she thought. A tale of the blind, wilful folly of childhood? Ah, my soul! Alas, my grown-up friends! Does the moral belong to childhood alone? Have manhood and womanhood no passionate, foolish longings for which we blind ourselves to obvious truth? and of which the vanity does not lessen the disappointment? Do we not still toil after rosebuds to find fuel mort? No voice answered Mrs. Over-the-Way's fanciful questions. The hyacinth nodded fragrantly on its stalk, and Ida nodded in her chair. She was fast asleep, happily asleep, with a smile upon her face. The shadows nodded gently on the walls, and like a shadow the little old lady stole quietly away. When Ida awoke, she found herself lying partly in the armchair and partly in the arms of Nurse, who was lifting her up. A candle flared upon the table. By the fire stood an empty chair, and the heavy scent that filled the room was as sweet as the remembrance of past happiness. The little old lady had vanished, and, but for the hyacinth, Ida would almost have doubted whether her visit had not been a dream. "Has Mrs. Over-the-Way been long gone, Nursey?" she asked, keeping her eyes upon the flower pot. "Ever so long," said Nurse. "And here you've been snoring away, and the old lady's been downstairs telling me how comfortably you were asleep, and she's coming again tomorrow evening if you're good." It was precisely 12 minutes since Mrs. Over-the-Way left the house, but Nurse was of a slightly exaggerative turn of mind, and few people speak exactly on the subject of time, especially when there is an opportunity of triumphing over someone who has been asleep before bedtime. The condition of Ida's being good was also the work of Nurse's own instructive fancy, but Ida caught eagerly at the welcome news of another visit. "Then she is not angry with me for falling asleep, Nursey. I was so comfortable, and she has such a nice voice I couldn't help it. I think I left off about the pugs. I wish I had a pug with a wrinkled black snout, don't you, Nursey?" "I'm sure I don't, Miss Ida. My father kept all sorts of pigs, and we used to have one with a black snout and black spots. But it was as ugly could be, and I never could fancy the bacon would be fit to eat. You must have been dreaming, I'm sure. The old lady would never tell you about such rubbish, I know." "It's pugs, not pigs, Nursey, and they're dogs, you know," said Ida, laughing. "How funny you are. And indeed she did tell me I couldn't have dreamt it. I never dreamt anything so nice in my life." "And never will, most likely," said Nurse, who was very skillful in concluding a subject which she did not want to discuss, and who was apt to do so by a rapid twist in the line of argument, which Ida would find somewhat bewildering. "But, dear Miss Ida," she continued, "do leave off clutching at that chair arm when I'm lifting you up, and your eyes'll drop out of your head if you go on staring like that." Ida relaxed the nervous grasp to which she had been impelled by her energy on the subject of the pugs, let down her eyebrows, and submitted to be undressed. The least pleasant part of this ceremony may be comprised in the word curl papers. Ida's hair was dark and soft and smooth, but other little girls wore ringlets, and so this little girl must wear ringlets too. To that end her hair was every night put into curl papers, with much tight twisting and sharp jerking. and Ida slept upon an irregular layer of small paper parcels, which made pillows a mockery. With all this, however, a damp day or a good romp would sometimes undo the night's work, to the great disgust of Nurse. In her last place, the young lady's hair had curled with a damp brush, as Ida well knew, and Nurse made so much of her own grievance in having to use the curl papers that no place was left for Ida's grievance in having to sleep upon them. She submitted this night, therefore, as other nights, in patience, and sat swinging her feet and accommodating her head to the sharp tugs, which always seemed to come from unexpected quarters. Perhaps, however, her mind may have been running a little upon grievances which made her say, "You know, Nursey, how you are always telling me I ought to be thankful for having things and not having things, and I wish you'd talk sense and not give way with your head so when I pull, Miss Ida," retorted Nurse. "Having things and not having things. I don't know what you mean." "Well, you know, Nursey, the other day when I said I didn't like bread and treacled so long before and soaked in, and you said I ought to be thankful that I had bread and treacle at all, and that I hadn't a wooden leg and to eat anything I could get, like the old sailor man at the corner. Well, do you know, I've thought of something I am so thankful for, and that is that I haven't a red screen to my bed. I really do think, Miss Ida," said Nurse, "that you'll go out of your mind some day with your outlandish fancies, and where you get them, I can't think. I'm sure I never put such things into your head." Ida laughed again. "Never mind, Nursey, it all belongs to the pug story. Am I done now? And when you've tucked me up, please, would you mind remembering to put the flower where I can see it when I wake?" Nurse did as she was asked, and Ida watched the hyacinth till she fell asleep, and she slept well. In the morning she took her old post at the window. The little old lady had never seemed so long in making her appearance, nor the bells so slow to begin. Chim chime, chim chime. There they were at last, and there was Mrs. Over the Way. She looked up, waved a bunch of snowdrops, and went after the bells. Ida kissed her hand and waved it over and over again, long after the little old lady was out of sight. "There's a kiss for you, dear Mrs. Over the Way," she cried, "and kisses for your flowers and your house and everything belonging to you, and for the bells and the church and everybody in it this morning, and—" But at this point of universal benevolence, Nurse carried her off to breakfast. The little old lady came to tea as before. She looked as well as ever, and Nurse was equally generous in the matter of tea and toast. Mrs. Overthaway told over again what Ida had missed in the story of Mrs. Moss, and Ida apologized with earnest distress for her uncivil conduct in falling asleep. "There I was snoring away when you were telling me such a delightful story," she exclaimed penitently. "Not snoring exactly, my dear," smiled the little old lady, "but you looked very happy." "I thought Nursey said so," said Ida. "Well, I'm very glad. It would have been too rude, and you know I don't know how it was, for I am so fond of stories. I like nothing so well." "Well, shall I try again?" said Mrs. Over-the-Way. "Perhaps I may find a more amusing one, and if it does put you to sleep, it won't do any harm. Indeed, I think the doctor will say I'm very good company for you." "You are very good, that I can tell him," said Ida fervently. "And please let it be about yourself again, if you can remember anything. I like true stories." "Talking of snoring," said Mrs. Overthaway, "reminds me of something that happened in my youth. And it is true, though, do you know it is a ghost story?" Ida danced in her chair. "That is just what I should like," she exclaimed. "Nurse has a ghost story belonging to a farmhouse, which she tells the housemaid. But she says she can't tell me till I am older, and I should so like to hear a ghost story if it isn't too horrid." "This ghost story isn't too horrid, I think," laughed the little old lady, "and if you will let me think a few minutes and then forgive my prosy way of telling it, you shall have it at once." There was a pause. The little old lady sat silent, and so sat Ida also, with her eyes intently fixed on Mrs. Over-the-Way's face, over which an occasional smile was passing. "It's about a ghost who snored," said the little old lady doubtfully. "Delicious," responded Ida. A king once died, as kings are apt to do, being as liable to shortness of breath as other mortals. It was high time this king abandoned his earth life, for he had lived in a sadly extravagant manner, and his subjects could spare him without the slightest inconvenience. His father had left him a full treasury, both money and jewels being in abundance. But the foolish king just deceased had squandered every penny in riotous living. He had then taxed his subjects until most of them became paupers, and this money vanished in more riotous living. Next he sold all the grand old furniture in the palace, all the silver and gold plate and bric-a-brac, all the rich carpets and furnishings, and even his own kingly wardrobe, reserving only a soiled and moth-eaten ermine robe to fold over his threadbare raiment. And he spent the money in further riotous living. Don't ask me to explain what riotous living is. I only know from hearsay that it is an excellent way to get rid of money. And so this spendthrift king found it. He now picked all the magnificent jewels from this kingly crown, and from the round ball on the top of his scepter, and sold them and spent the money. Riotous living, of course. But at last he was at the end of his resources. He couldn't sell the crown itself because no one but the king had the right to wear it. Neither could he sell the royal palace because only the king had the right to live there. So, finally, he found himself reduced to a bare palace, containing only a big mahogany bedstead that he slept in, a small stool on which he sat to pull off his shoes, and the moth-eaten ermine robe. In this strait he was reduced to the necessity of borrowing an occasional dime from his chief counselor, with which to buy a ham sandwich. And the chief counselor hadn't many dimes. One who counseled his king so foolishly was likely to ruin his own prospects as well. So the king, having nothing more to live for, died suddenly and left a 10-year-old son to inherit the dismantled kingdom, the moth-eaten robe, and the jewel-stripped crown. No one envied the child, who had scarcely been thought of until he became king himself. Then he was recognized as a personage of some importance, and the politicians and hangers-on, headed by the chief counselor of the kingdom, held a meeting to determine what could be done for him. These folk had helped the old king to live riotously while his money lasted, and now they were poor and too proud to work. So they tried to think of a plan that would bring more money into the little king's treasury, where it would be handy for them to help themselves. After the meeting was over, the chief counselor came to the young king, who was playing peg-top in the courtyard, and said, "Your Majesty, we have thought of a way to restore your kingdom to its former power and magnificence." "All right," replied His Majesty carelessly. "How will you do it?" "By marrying you to a lady of great wealth," replied the counselor. "Marrying me?" cried the king. "Why, I am only 10 years old." "I know, it is to be regretted, but your Majesty will grow older, and the affairs of the kingdom demand that you marry a wife." "Can't I marry a mother instead?" asked the poor little king, who had lost his mother when a baby. "Certainly not," declared the counselor. "To marry a mother would be illegal. To marry a wife is right and proper." "Can't you marry her yourself?" inquired His Majesty, aiming his peg-top at the chief counselor's toe, and laughing to see how he jumped to escape it. "Let me explain," said the other. "You haven't a penny in the world, but you have a kingdom. There are many rich women who would be glad to give their wealth in exchange for a queen's coronet, even if the king is but a child. So we have decided to advertise that the one who bids the highest shall become the Queen of Quok." "If I must marry at all," said the king after a moment's thought, "I prefer to marry Nyana, the armorer's daughter." "She is too poor," replied the counselor. "Her teeth are pearls, her eyes are amethysts, and her hair is gold," declared the little king. "True, your Majesty, but consider that your wife's wealth must be used. How would Nyana look after you have pulled her teeth of pearls, plucked out her amethyst eyes, and shaved her golden head?" The boy shuddered. "Have your own way," he said despairingly. "Only let the lady be as dainty as possible and a good playfellow." "We shall do our best," returned the chief counselor, and went away to advertise throughout the neighboring kingdoms for a wife for the boy king of Quok. There were so many applicants for the privilege of marrying the little king that it was decided to put him up at auction, in order that the largest possible sum of money should be brought into the kingdom. So, on the day appointed, The ladies gathered at the palace from all the surrounding kingdoms, from Bilkon, Mulgravia, Junkum, and even as far away as the Republic of Macvelt. The chief counselor came to the palace early in the morning and had the king's face washed and his hair combed, and then he padded the inside of the crown with old newspapers to make it small enough to fit his majesty's head. It was a sorry-looking crown, having many big and little holes in it where the jewels had once been, and it had been neglected and knocked around until it was quite battered and tarnished. Yet, as the counselor said, it was the king's crown, and it was quite proper he should wear it on the solemn occasion of his auction. Like all boys, be they kings or paupers, His Majesty had torn and soiled his one suit of clothes so that they were hardly presentable, and there was no money to buy new ones. Therefore the counselor wound the old ermine robe around the king and sat him upon the stool in the middle of the otherwise empty audience chamber. And around him stood all the courtiers and politicians and hangers-on of the kingdom, consisting of such people as were too proud or lazy to work for a living. There was a great number of them, you may be sure, and they made an imposing appearance. Then the doors of the audience chamber were thrown open, and the wealthy ladies who aspired to being Queen of Quock came trooping in. The king looked them over with much anxiety and decided they were each and all old enough to be his grandmother, and ugly enough to scare away the crows from the royal cornfields. After which he lost interest in them. But the rich ladies never looked at the poor little king squatting upon his stool. They gathered at once about the chief counselor who acted as auctioneer. "How much am I offered for the coronet of the Queen of Quock?" asked the counselor in a loud voice. "Where is the coronet?" inquired a fussy old lady who had just buried her 9th husband and was worth several millions. "There isn't any coronet at present," explained the chief counselor, "but whoever bids highest will have the right to wear one, and she can then buy it." "Oh," said the fussy old lady, "I see." Then she added, "I'll bid $14. $14,000, cried a sour-looking woman who was thin and tall and had wrinkles all over her skin. Like a frosted apple, the king thought. The bidding now became fast and furious, and the poverty-stricken courtiers brightened up as the sum began to mount into the millions. "He'll bring us a very pretty fortune after all," whispered one to his comrade, "and then we shall have the pleasure of helping him spend it." The king began to be anxious. All the women who looked at all kind-hearted or pleasant had stopped bidding for lack of money, and the slender old dame with the wrinkles seemed determined to get the coronet at any price, and with it the boy husband. This ancient creature finally became so excited that her wig got crosswise of her head, and her false teeth kept slipping out, which horrified the little king greatly, but she would not give up. At last the chief counselor ended the auction by crying out, sold to Mary Ann Brzezinski de la Porcus for $3,900,624.16. And the sour-looking old woman paid the money in cash and on the spot, which proves this is a fairy story. The king was so disturbed at the thought that he must marry this hideous creature that he began to wail and weep, whereupon the woman boxed his ears soundly. But the counselor reproved her for punishing her future husband in public, saying, "You are not married yet. Wait until tomorrow, after the wedding takes place. Then you can abuse him as much as you wish. But at present we prefer to have people think this is a love match." The poor king slept but little that night, so filled was he with terror of his future wife. Nor could he get the idea out of his head that he preferred to marry the armorer's daughter, who was about his own age. He tossed and tumbled around upon his hard bed until the moonlight came in at the window and lay like a great white sheet upon the bare floor. Finally, in turning over for the 100th time, his hand struck against a secret spring in the headboard of the big mahogany bedstead, and at once, with a sharp click, a panel flew open. The noise caused the king to look up, and seeing the open panel, he stood upon tiptoe and, reaching within, drew out a folded paper. It had several leaves fastened together like a book, and upon the first page was written, "When the king is in trouble, this leaf he must double and set it on fire to obtain his desire." This was not very good poetry, but when the king had spelled it out in the moonlight, he was filled with joy. "There's no doubt about my being in trouble," he exclaimed, "so I'll burn it at once and see what happens." He tore off the leaf and put the rest of the book in its secret hiding place. Then, folding the paper double, he placed it on the top of his stool, lighted a match, and set fire to it. It made a horrid smudge for so small a paper, and the king sat on the edge of the bed and watched it eagerly. When the smoke cleared away, he was surprised to see, sitting upon the stool, a round little man who, with folded arms and crossed legs, sat calmly facing the king and smoking a black briarwood pipe. "Well, here I am," said he. "So I see," replied the little king. "But how did you get here?" "Didn't you burn the paper?" demanded the round man by way of answer. "Yes, I did," acknowledged the king. "Then you are in trouble, and I've come to help you out of it. I'm the slave of the royal bedstead." "Oh," said the king, "I didn't know there was one." "Neither did your father, or he would not have been so foolish as to sell everything he had for money. By the way, it's lucky for you he did not sell this bedstead. Now then, what do you want?" "I'm not sure what I want," replied the king, "but I know what I don't want, and that is the old woman who is going to marry me." "That's easy enough," said the slave of the royal bedstead. "All you need do is to return her the money she paid the chief counselor and declare the match off. Don't be afraid. You are the king, and your word is law." "To be sure," said the Majesty, "but I am in great need of money. How am I going to live if the chief counselor returns to Mary Ann Brzezinski her millions?" "Phoo!" "That's easy enough," again answered the man, and putting his hand in his pocket, he drew out and tossed to the king an old-fashioned leather purse. "Keep that with you," said he, "and you will always be rich, for you can take out of the purse as many 25-cent silver pieces as you wish, one at a time. No matter how often you take one out, another will instantly appear in its place within the purse." "Thank you," said the king gratefully. "You have rendered me a rare favor, for now I shall have money for all my needs and will not be obliged to marry anyone. Thank you 1,000 times." "Don't mention it," answered the other, puffing his pipe slowly and watching the smoke curl into the moonlight. "Such things are easy to me. Is that all you want?" "All I can think of just now," returned the king. "Then please close that secret panel in the bedstead," said the man. "The other leaves of the book may be of use to you some time." The boy stood upon the bed as before and, reaching up, closed the opening so that no one else could discover it. Then he turned to face his visitor, but the slave of the royal bedstead had disappeared. "I expected that," said his majesty. "Yet I am sorry he did not wait to say goodbye." With a lightened heart and a sense of great relief, the boy king placed the leathern purse underneath his pillow, and climbing into bed again, slept soundly until morning. When the sun rose, his majesty rose also, refreshed and comforted, and the first thing he did was to send for the chief counselor. That mighty personage arrived looking glum and unhappy, but the boy was too full of his own good fortune to notice it. Said he, "I have decided not to marry anyone, for I have just come into a fortune of my own. Therefore I command you return to that old woman the money she has paid you for the right to wear the coronet of the Queen of Quock, and make public declaration that the wedding will not take place." Hearing this, the counselor began to tremble, for he saw the young king had decided to reign in earnest, and he looked so guilty that his majesty inquired, "Well, what is the matter now?" "Sire," replied the wretch in a shaking voice, "I cannot return the woman her money, for I have lost it." "Lost it!" cried the king in mingled astonishment and anger. "Even so, your majesty. On my way home from the auction last night, I stopped at the drug-store to get some potash lozenges for my throat, which was dry and hoarse with so much loud talking. And your majesty will admit it was through my efforts the woman was induced to pay so great a price. Well, going into the drug-store, I carelessly left the package of money lying on the seat of my carriage, and when I came out again it was gone, nor was the thief anywhere to be seen." "Did you call the police?" asked the king. "Yes, I called, but they were all on the next block, and although they have promised to search for the robber, I have little hope they will ever find him." The king sighed. "What shall we do now?" he asked. "I fear you must marry Mary Ann Brodzinski," answered the chief counselor, unless indeed you order the executioner to cut her head off. That would be wrong, declared the king. The woman must not be harmed, and it is just that we return her money, for I will not marry her under any circumstances. Is that private fortune you mentioned large enough to repay her? Asked the counselor. Why, yes, said the king thoughtfully. But it will take some time to do it, and that shall be your task. Call the woman here. The counselor went in search of Mary Ann, who, when she heard she was not to become a queen, but would receive her money back, flew into a violent passion and boxed the chief counselor's ears so viciously that they stung for nearly an hour. But she followed him into the king's audience chamber, where she demanded her money in a loud voice, claiming as well the interest due upon it overnight. The counselor has lost your money, said the boy king, but he shall pay you every penny out of my own private purse. I fear, however, you will be obliged to take it in small change. That will not matter, she said, scowling upon the counselor as if she longed to reach his ears again. I don't care how small the change is so long as I get every penny that belongs to me, and the interest. Where is it? Here, answered the king, handing the counselor the leathern purse. It is all in silver quarters, and they must be taken from the purse one at a time. But there will be plenty to pay your demands, and to spare. So, there being no chairs, the counselor sat down upon the floor in one corner and began counting out silver 25-cent pieces from the purse, one by one. And the old woman sat upon the floor opposite him and took each piece of money from his hand. It was a large sum, $3,900,624.16, and it takes 4 times as many 25-cent pieces as it would dollars to make up the amount. The king left them sitting there and went to school, and often thereafter he came to the counselor and interrupted him long enough to get from the purse what money he needed to reign in a proper and dignified manner. This somewhat delayed the counting, but as it was a long job anyway, that did not matter much. The king grew to manhood and married the pretty daughter of the armorer, and they now have 2 lovely children of their own. Once in a while they go into the big audience chamber of the palace and let the little ones watch the aged, hoary-headed counselor count out silver 25-cent pieces to a withered old woman who watched his every movement to see that he does not cheat her. It is a big sum, $3,900,624.16 in 25-cent pieces. But this is how the counselor was punished for being so careless with the woman's money. And this is how Mary Ann Brodzinski de la Porcus was also punished for wishing to marry a 10-year-old king in order that she might wear the coronet of the Queen of Quock. There lived in Boston a wise and ancient chemist by the name of Dr. Dawes, who dabbled somewhat in magic. There also lived in Boston a young lady by the name of Clarabelle Sudds, who was possessed of much money, little wit, and an intense desire to go upon the stage. So Clarabelle went to Dr. Dawes and said, "I can neither sing nor dance. I cannot recite verse nor play upon the piano. I am no acrobat, nor leper, nor high kicker. Yet I wish to go upon the stage. What shall I do?" "Are you willing to pay for such accomplishments?" asked the wise chemist. "Certainly," answered Clarabelle, jingling her purse. "Then come to me tomorrow at 2 o'clock," said he. All that night he practiced what is known as chemical sorcery, so that when Clarabelle Sudds came next day at 2 o'clock, he showed her a small box filled with compounds that closely resembled French bonbons. "This is a progressive age," said the old man, "and I flatter myself your Uncle Dawes keeps right along with the procession. Now, one of your old-fashioned sorcerers would have made you some nasty, bitter pills to swallow, but I have consulted your taste and convenience. Here are some magic bonbons. If you eat this one with the lavender color, you can dance thereafter as lightly and gracefully as if you had been trained a lifetime. After you consume the pink confection, you will sing like a nightingale. Eating the white one will enable you to become the finest elocutionist in the land. The chocolate piece will charm you into playing the piano better than Rubinstein, while after eating the lemon-yellow bonbon you can easily kick 6 feet above your head." "How delightful!" exclaimed Clarabelle, who was truly enraptured. "You are certainly a most clever sorcerer as well as a considerate compounder," and she held out her hand for the box. "Ahem," said the wise one. "A check, please." "Oh yes, to be sure. How stupid of me to forget it," she returned. He considerately retained the box in his own hand while she signed a check for a large amount of money, after which he allowed her to hold the box herself. "Are you sure you have made them strong enough?" she inquired anxiously. "It usually takes a great deal to affect me." "My only fear," replied Dr. Dawes, "is that I have made them too strong, for this is the first time I have ever been called upon to prepare these wonderful confections." "Don't worry," said Clarabelle. "The stronger they act, the better I shall act myself." She went away after saying this, but stopping in at a dry goods store to shop, she forgot the precious box in her new interest and left it lying on the ribbon counter. Then little Bessie Bostwick came to the counter to buy a hair ribbon and laid her parcels beside the box. When she went away, she gathered up the box with her other bundles and trotted off home with it. Bessie never knew, until after she had hung her coat in the hall closet and counted up her parcels, that she had one too many. Then she opened it and exclaimed, "Why, it's a box of candy. Someone must have mislaid it. But it is too small a matter to worry about. There are only a few pieces." So she dumped the contents of the box into a bonbon dish that stood upon the hall table, and picking out the chocolate piece, she was fond of chocolates, ate it daintily while she examined her purchases. These were not many, for Bessie was only 12 years old and was not yet trusted by her parents to expend much money at the stores. But while she tried on the hair ribbon, she suddenly felt a great desire to play upon the piano. And the desire at last became so overpowering that she went into the parlor and opened the instrument. The little girl had, with infinite pains, contrived to learn 2 pieces, which she usually executed with a jerky movement of her right hand, and a left hand that forgot to keep up, and so made dreadful discords. But under the influence of the chocolate bonbon, she sat down and ran her fingers lightly over the keys, producing such exquisite harmony that she was filled with amazement at her own performance. That was the prelude, however. The next moment she dashed into Beethoven's 7th Sonata and played it magnificently. Her mother, hearing the unusual burst of melody, came downstairs to see what musical guest had arrived. But when she discovered it was her own little daughter who was playing so divinely, she had an attack of palpitation of the heart, to which she was subject, and sat down upon a sofa until it should pass away. Meanwhile, Bessie played one piece after another with untiring energy. She loved music, and now found that all she need do was to sit at the piano and listen and watch her hands twinkle over the keyboard. Twilight deepened in the room, and Bessie's father came home and hung up his hat and overcoat and placed his umbrella in the rack. Then he peeped into the parlor to see who was playing. "Great Caesar!" he exclaimed. But the mother came to him softly with her finger on her lips and whispered, "Don't interrupt her, John. Our child seems to be in a trance. Did you ever hear such superb music?" "Why, she's an infant prodigy," gasped the astounded father. "Beats Blind Tom all hollow. It's wonderful." As they stood listening, the senator arrived, having been invited to dine with them that evening. And before he had taken off his coat, the Yale professor, a man of deep learning and scholarly attainments, joined the party. Bessie played on, and the 4 elders stood in a huddled but silent and amazed group, listening to the music and waiting for the sound of the dinner gong. Mr. Bostwick, who was hungry, picked up the bonbon dish that lay on the table beside him and ate the pink confection. The professor was watching him, so Mr. Bostwick courteously held the dish toward him. The professor ate the lemon-yellow piece, and the senator reached out his hand and took the lavender piece. He did not eat it, however, for, chancing to remember that it might spoil his dinner, he put it in his vest pocket. Mrs. Bostwick, still intently listening to her precocious daughter without thinking what she did, took the remaining piece, which was the white one, and slowly devoured it. The dish was now empty, and Claribel Sudd's precious bonbons had passed from her possession forever. Suddenly Mr. Bostwick, who was a big man, began to sing in a shrill tremolo soprano voice. It was not the same song Bessie was playing, and the discord was shocking that the professor smiled. The senator put his hands to his ears, and Mrs. Bostwick cried in a horrified voice, "William!" Her husband continued to sing, as if endeavoring to emulate the famous Christine Nilsson, and paid no attention whatever to his wife or his guests. Fortunately, the dinner gong now sounded, and Mrs. Bostwick dragged Bessie from the piano and ushered her guests into the dining room. Mr. Bostwick followed, singing "The Last Rose of Summer," as if it had been an encore demanded by 1,000 delighted hearers. The poor woman was in despair at witnessing her husband's undignified actions, and wondered what she might do to control him. The professor seemed more grave than usual. The senator's face wore an offended expression, and Bessie kept moving her fingers as if she still wanted to play the piano. Mrs. Bostwick managed to get them all seated, although her husband had broken into another area, and then the maid brought in the soup. When she carried a plate to the professor, he cried in an excited voice, "Hold it higher! Higher! I say!" And springing up, he gave it a sudden kick that sent it nearly to the ceiling, from whence the dish descended to scatter soup over Bessie and the maid, and to smash in pieces upon the crown of the professor's bald head. At this atrocious act, the senator rose from his seat with an exclamation of horror and glanced at his hostess. For some time Mrs. Bostwick had been staring straight ahead with a dazed expression, but now, catching the senator's eye, she bowed gracefully and began reciting "The Charge of the Light Brigade" in forceful tones. The senator shuddered. Such disgraceful rioting he had never seen nor heard before in a decent private family. He felt that his reputation was at stake, and, being the only sane person apparently in the room, there was no one to whom he might appeal. The maid had run away to cry hysterically in the kitchen. Mr. Bostwick was singing "Oh, Promise Me." The professor was trying to kick the globes off the chandelier. Mrs. Bostwick had switched her recitation to "The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck," and Bessie had stolen into the parlor and was pounding out the overture from the "Flying Dutchman." The senator was not at all sure he would not go crazy himself presently, so he slipped away from the turmoil and, catching up his hat and coat in the hall, hurried from the house. That night he sat up late writing a political speech he was to deliver the next afternoon at Faneuil Hall. But his experiences at the Bostwicks had so unnerved him that he could scarcely collect his thoughts, and often he would pause and shake his head pityingly as he remembered the strange things he had seen in that usually respectable home. The next day he met Mr. Bostwick in the street, but passed him by with a stony glare of oblivion. He felt he really could not afford to know this gentleman in the future. Mr. Bostwick was naturally indignant at the direct snub, yet in his mind lingered a faint memory of some quite unusual occurrences at his dinner party the evening before, and he hardly knew whether he dared resent the senator's treatment or not. The political meeting was the feature of the day, for the senator's eloquence was well known in Boston. so the big hall was crowded with people, and in one of the front rows sat the Bostwick family, with the learned Yale professor beside them. They all looked tired and pale, as if they had passed a rather dissipated evening, and the senator was rendered so nervous by seeing them that he refused to look in their direction a second time. While the mayor was introducing him, the great man sat fidgeting in his chair, and happening to put his thumb and finger into his vest pocket, he found the lavender-colored bonbon he had placed there the evening before. "This may clear my throat," thought the senator, and slipped the bonbon into his mouth. A few minutes afterwards he arose before the vast audience which greeted him with enthusiastic plaudits. "My friends," began the senator in a grave voice, "this is a most impressive and important occasion." Then he paused, balanced himself upon his left foot, and kicked his right leg into the air in the way favored by ballet dancers. There was a hum of amazement and horror from the spectators, but the senator appeared not to notice it. He whirled around upon the tips of his toes, kicked right and left in a graceful manner, and startled a bald-headed man in the front row by casting a languishing glance in his direction. Suddenly, Clarabelle Sudds, who happened to be present, uttered a scream and sprang to her feet, pointing an accusing finger at the dancing senator. She cried in a loud voice, "That's the man who stole my bonbons! Seize him! Arrest him! Don't let him escape!" But the ushers rushed her out of the hall, thinking she had gone suddenly insane, and the senator's friends seized him firmly and carried him out the stage entrance to the street, where they put him into an open carriage and instructed the driver to take him home. The effect of the magic bonbon was still powerful enough to control the poor senator, who stood upon the rear seat of the carriage and danced energetically all the way home, to the delight of the crowd of small boys who followed the carriage and the grief of the sober-minded citizens who shook their heads sadly and whispered that another good man had gone wrong. It took the senator several months to recover from the shame and humiliation of this escapade, and curiously enough, he never had the slightest idea what had induced him to act in so extraordinary a manner. Perhaps it was fortunate the last bonbon had now been eaten, for they might easily have caused considerably more trouble than they did. Of course, Clarabelle went again to the wise chemist and signed a check for another box of magic bonbons, but she must have taken better care of these, for she is now a famous vaudeville actress. This story should teach us the folly of condemning others for actions that we do not understand, for we never know what may happen to ourselves. It may also serve as a hint to be careful about leaving parcels in public places, and incidentally to let other people's packages severely alone. The capture of Father Time. Jim was the son of a cowboy and lived on the broad plains of Arizona. His father had trained him to lasso a bronco or a young bull with perfect accuracy, and had Jim possessed the strength to back up his skill, he would have been as good a cowboy as any in all Arizona. When he was 12 years old, he made his first visit to the East, where Uncle Charles, his father's brother, lived. Of course, Jim took his lasso with him, for he was proud of his skill in casting it, and wanted to show his cousins what a cowboy could do. At first, the city boys and girls were much interested in watching Jim lasso posts and fence pickets, but they soon tired of it, and even Jim decided it was not the right sort of sport for cities. But one day the butcher asked Jim to ride one of his horses into the country, to a pasture that had been engaged, and Jim eagerly consented. He had been longing for a horseback ride, and to make it seem like old times he took his lasso with him. He rode through the streets demurely enough, but on reaching the open country roads, his spirits broke forth into wild jubilation, and urging the butcher's horse to full gallop, he dashed away in true cowboy fashion. Then he wanted still more liberty, and letting down the bars that led into a big field, he began riding over the meadow and throwing his lasso at imaginary cattle, while he yelled and whooped to his heart's content. Suddenly, on making a long cast with his lasso, the loop caught upon something and rested about 3 feet from the ground, while the rope drew taut and nearly pulled Jim from his horse. This was unexpected. More than that, it was wonderful, for the field seemed bare of even a stump. Jim's eyes grew big with amazement, but he knew he had caught something when a voice cried out, "Here, let go! Let go, I say! Can't you see what you've done?" No, Jim couldn't see, nor did he intend to let go until he found out what was holding the loop of the lasso. So he resorted to an old trick his father had taught him, and putting the butcher's horse to a run, began riding in a circle around the spot where his lasso had caught. As he thus drew nearer and nearer his quarry, he saw the rope coil up, yet it looked to be coiling over nothing but air. One end of the lasso was made fast to a ring in the saddle, and when the rope was almost wound up and the horse began to pull away and snort with fear, Jim dismounted. Holding the reins of the bridle in one hand, he followed the rope, and an instant later saw an old man caught fast in the coils of the lasso. His head was bald and uncovered, but long white whiskers grew down to his waist. About his body was thrown a loose robe of fine white linen. In one hand he bore a great scythe, and beneath the other arm he carried an hourglass. While Jim gazed wonderingly upon him, this venerable old man spoke in an angry voice. "Now then, get that rope off as fast as you can. You've brought everything on earth to a standstill by your foolishness. Well, what are you staring at? Don't you know who I am?" "No," said Jim stupidly. "Well, I'm Time, Father Time. Now make haste and set me free, if you want the world to run properly." "How did I happen to catch you?" asked Jim, without making a move to release his captive. "I don't know. I've never been caught before," growled Father Time. "But I suppose it was because you were foolishly throwing your lasso at nothing." "I didn't see you," said Jim. "Of course you didn't. I'm invisible to the eyes of human beings unless they get within 3 feet of me, and I take care to keep more than that distance away from them. That's why I was crossing this field, where I supposed no one would be, and I should have been perfectly safe had it not been for your beastly lasso. Now then, he added crossly, are you going to get that rope off? Why should I? Asked Jim. Because everything in the world stopped moving the moment you caught me. I don't suppose you want to make an end of all business and pleasure and war and love and misery and ambition and everything else, do you? Not a watch has ticked since you tied me up here like a mummy. Jim laughed. It really was funny to see the old man wound round and round with coils of rope from his knees up to his chin. It'll do you good to rest, said the boy. From all I've heard, you lead a rather busy life. Indeed I do, replied Father Time with a sigh. I'm due in Kamchatka this very minute, and to think one small boy is upsetting all my regular habits. Too bad, said Jim with a grin. But since the world has stopped anyhow, it won't matter if it takes a little longer recess. As soon as I let you go, time will fly again. Where are your wings? I haven't any, answered the old man. That is a story cooked up by someone who never saw me. As a matter of fact, I move rather slowly. I see, you take your time, remarked the boy. What do you use that scythe for? To mow down the people, said the ancient one. Every time I swing my scythe, someone dies. Then I ought to win a life-saving medal by keeping you tied up, said Jim. Some folks will live this much longer. But they won't know it, said Father Time with a sad smile. So it will do them no good. You may as well untie me at once. No, said Jim with a determined air. I may never capture you again. So I'll hold you for a while and see how the world wags without you. Then he swung the old man, bound as he was, upon the back of the butcher's horse, and getting into the saddle himself, started back toward town, one hand holding his prisoner and the other guiding the reins. When he reached the road, his eye fell on a strange tableau. A horse and buggy stood in the middle of the road, the horse in the act of trotting, with his head held high and 2 legs in the air, but perfectly motionless. In the buggy a man and a woman were seated, but had they been turned into stone they could not have been more still and stiff. There's no time for them, sighed the old man. Won't you let me go now? Not yet, replied the boy. He rode on until he reached the city, where all the people stood in exactly the same positions they were in when Jim lassoed Father Time. Stopping in front of a big dry goods store, the boy hitched his horse and went in. The clerks were measuring out goods and showing patterns to the rows of customers in front of them. But everyone seemed suddenly to have become a statue. There was something very unpleasant in this scene, and a cold shiver began to run up and down Jim's back, so he hurried out again. On the edge of the sidewalk sat a poor, crippled beggar, holding out his hat, and beside him stood a prosperous-looking gentleman who was about to drop a penny into the beggar's hat. Jim knew this gentleman to be very rich, but rather stingy. So he ventured to run his hand into the man's pocket and take out his purse, in which was a $20 gold piece. This glittering coin he put in the gentleman's fingers instead of the penny, and then restored the purse to the rich man's pocket. That donation will surprise him when he comes to life, thought the boy. He mounted the horse again and rode up the street. As he passed the shop of his friend, the butcher, he noticed several pieces of meat hanging outside. "I'm afraid that meat'll spoil," he remarked. "It takes time to spoil meat," answered the old man. This struck Jim as being queer, but true. "It seems time meddles with everything," said he. "Yes, you've made a prisoner of the most important personage in the world," groaned the old man, "and you haven't enough sense to let him go again." Jim did not reply, and soon they came to his uncle's house, where he again dismounted. The street was filled with teams and people, but all were motionless. His two little cousins were just coming out the gate on their way to school, with their books and slates underneath their arms. So Jim had to jump over the fence to avoid knocking them down. In the front room sat his aunt, reading her Bible. She was just turning a page when time stopped. In the dining room was his uncle, finishing his luncheon. His mouth was open and his fork poised just before it, while his eyes were fixed upon the newspaper folded beside him. Jim helped himself to his uncle's pie, and while he ate it, he walked out to his prisoner. "There's one thing I don't understand," said he. "What's that?" asked Father Time. "Why is it that I'm able to move around while everyone else is froze up?" "That is because I'm your prisoner," answered the other. "You can do anything you wish with time now. But unless you are careful, you'll do something you will be sorry for." Jim threw the crust of his pie at a bird that was suspended in the air, where it had been flying when time stopped. "Anyway," he laughed, "I'm living longer than anyone else. No one will ever be able to catch up with me again. Each life has its allotted span," said the old man. "When you have lived your proper time, my scythe will mow you down." "I forgot your scythe," said Jim thoughtfully. Then a spirit of mischief came into the boy's head, for he happened to think that the present opportunity to have fun would never occur again. He tied Father Time to his uncle's hitching post, that he might not escape, and then crossed the road to the corner grocery. The grocer had scolded Jim that very morning for stepping into a basket of turnips by accident. So the boy went to the back end of the grocery and turned on the faucet of the molasses barrel. "That'll make a nice mess when time starts the molasses running all over the floor," said Jim with a laugh. A little further down the street was a barber shop, and sitting in the barber's chair, Jim saw the man that all the boys declared was the meanest man in town. He certainly did not like the boys, and the boys knew it. The barber was in the act of shampooing this person when time was captured. Jim ran to the drugstore and, getting a bottle of mucilage, he returned and poured it over the ruffled hair of the unpopular citizen. "That'll probably surprise him when he wakes up," thought Jim. Nearby was the schoolhouse. Jim entered it and found that only a few of the pupils were assembled, but the teacher sat at his desk, stern and frowning as usual. Taking a piece of chalk, Jim marked upon the blackboard in big letters the following words: "Every scholar is requested to yell the minute he enters the room. He will also please throw his books at the teacher's head. Signed, Prof. Sharp." "That ought to raise a nice rumpus," murmured the mischief maker as he walked away. On the corner stood Policeman Mulligan, talking with old Miss Scrapple, the worst gossip in town, who always delighted in saying something disagreeable about her neighbors. Jim thought this opportunity was too good to lose. So he took off the policeman's cap and brass-buttoned coat and put them on Miss Scrapple, while the lady's feathered and ribboned hat he placed jauntily upon the policeman's head. The effect was so comical that the boy laughed aloud, and as a good many people were standing near the corner, Jim decided that Miss Scrapple and Officer Mulligan would create a sensation when time started upon his travels. Then the young cowboy remembered his prisoner, and, walking back to the hitching post, he came within 3 feet of it and saw Father Time still standing patiently within the toils of the lasso. He looked angry and annoyed, however, and growled out, "Well, when do you intend to release me?" "I've been thinking about that ugly scythe of yours," said Jim. "What about it?" asked Father Time. "Perhaps if I let you go you'll swing it at me the first thing to be revenged," replied the boy. Father Time gave him a severe look, but said, "I've known boys for thousands of years, and of course I know they're mischievous and reckless. But I like boys, because they grow up to be men and people my world. Now if a man had caught me by accident, as you did, I could have scared him into letting me go instantly. But boys are harder to scare. I don't know as I blame you. I was a boy myself, long ago when the world was new. But surely you've had enough fun with me by this time, and now I hope you'll show the respect that is due to old age. Let me go, and in return I will promise to forget all about my capture. The incident won't do much harm anyway, for no one will ever know that time has halted the last 3 hours or so." "All right," said Jim cheerfully. "Since you've promised not to mow me down, I'll let you go." But he had a notion some people in the town would suspect time had stopped when they returned to life. He carefully unwound the rope from the old man, who, when he was free, at once shouldered his scythe, rearranged his white robe, and nodded farewell. The next moment he had disappeared, and with a rustle and rumble and roar of activity the world came to life again, and jogged along as it always had before. Jim wound up his lasso, mounted the butcher's horse, and rode slowly down the street. Loud screams came from the corner, where a great crowd of people quickly assembled. From his seat on the horse, Jim saw Miss Scrapple, attired in the policeman's uniform, angrily shaking her fists in Mulligan's face, while the officer was furiously stamping upon the lady's hat, which he had torn from his own head amidst the jeers of the crowd. As he rode past the schoolhouse, he heard a tremendous chorus of yells, and knew Provençal Sharp was having a hard time to quell the riot caused by the sign on the blackboard. Through the window of the barber shop, he saw the mean man frantically belaboring the barber with a hairbrush, while his hair stood up stiff as bayonets in all directions. And the grocer ran out of his door and yelled, "Fire!" while his shoes left a track of molasses wherever he stepped. Jim's heart was filled with joy. He was fairly reveling in the excitement he had caused when someone caught his leg and pulled him from the horse. "What are you doing here, you rascal?" cried the butcher angrily. "Didn't you promise to put that beast inter Plimpton's pasture? And now I find you riding the poor nag around like a gentleman of leisure." "That's a fact," said Jim with surprise. "I clean forgot about the horse." This story should teach us the supreme importance of time and the folly of trying to stop it. For should you succeed, as Jim did, in bringing time to a standstill, the world would soon become a dreary place, and life decidedly unpleasant. The king of the polar bears lived among the icebergs in the far north country. He was old and monstrous big. He was wise and friendly to all who knew him. His body was thickly covered with long white hair that glistened like silver under the rays of the midnight sun. His claws were strong and sharp, that he might walk safely over the smooth ice or grasp and tear the fishes and seals upon which he fed. The seals were afraid when he drew near, and tried to avoid him, but the gulls, both white and gray, loved him because he left the remnants of his feasts for them to devour. Often his subjects, the polar bears, came to him for advice when ill or in trouble, but they wisely kept away from his hunting grounds, lest they might interfere with his sport and arouse his anger. The wolves, who sometimes came as far north as the icebergs, whispered among themselves that the king of the polar bears was either a magician or under the protection of a powerful fairy, for no earthly thing seemed able to harm him. He never failed to secure plenty of food, and he grew bigger and stronger day by day and year by year. Yet the time came when this monarch of the north met man, and his wisdom failed him. He came out of his cave among the icebergs one day, and saw a boat moving through the strip of water which had been uncovered by the shifting of the summer ice. In the boat were men. The great bear had never seen such creatures before, and therefore advanced toward the boat, sniffing the strange scent with aroused curiosity, and wondering whether he might take them for friends or foes, food or carrion. When the king came near the water's edge, a man stood up in the boat, and with a queer instrument made a loud bang. The polar bear felt a shock. His brain became numb, his thoughts deserted him, his great limbs shook and gave way beneath him, and his body fell heavily upon the hard ice. That was all he remembered for a time. When he awoke, he was smarting with pain on every inch of his huge bulk, for the men had cut away his hide with its glorious white hair and carried it with them to a distant ship. Above him circled thousands of his friends, the gulls, wondering if their benefactor were really dead and it was proper to eat him. But when they saw him raise his head and groan and tremble, they knew he still lived. And one of them said to his comrades, "The wolves were right. The king is a great magician, for even men cannot kill him, but he suffers for lack of covering. Let us repay his kindness to us by each giving him as many feathers as we can spare." This idea pleased the gulls. One after another they plucked with their beaks the softest feathers from under their wings, and flying down, dropped them gently upon the body of the king of the polar bears. Then they called to him in a chorus, "Courage, friend! Our feathers are as soft and beautiful as your own shaggy hair. They will guard you from the cold winds and warm you while you sleep. Have courage then, and live." And the king of the polar bears had courage to bear his pain, and lived and was strong again. The feathers grew as they had grown upon the bodies of the birds, and covered him as his own hair had done. Mostly they were pure white in color, but some from the gray gulls gave his majesty a slight mottled appearance. The rest of that summer and all through the 6 months of night, the king left his icy cavern only to fish or catch seals for food. He felt no shame at his feathery covering, but it was still strange to him, and he avoided meeting any of his brother bears. During this period of retirement he thought much of the men who had harmed him, and remembered the way they had made the great bang, and he decided it was best to keep away from such fierce creatures. Thus he added to his store of wisdom. When the moon fell away from the sky and the sun came to make the icebergs glitter with the gorgeous tintings of the rainbow, 2 of the polar bears arrived at the king's cavern to ask his advice about the hunting season. But when they saw his great body covered with feathers instead of hair, they began to laugh, and one said, "Our mighty king has become a bird. Who ever before heard of a feathered polar bear?" Then the king gave way to wrath. He advanced upon them with deep growls and stately tread, and with one blow of his monstrous paw stretched the mocker lifeless at his feet. The other ran away to his fellows and carried the news of the king's strange appearance. The result was a meeting of all the polar bears upon a broad field of ice, where they talked gravely of the remarkable change that had come upon their monarch. "He is in reality no longer a bear," said one, "nor can he justly be called a bird. But he is half bird and half bear, and so unfitted to remain our king." "Then who shall take his place?" asked another. "He who can fight the bird bear and overcome him," answered an aged member of the group. "Only the strongest is fit to rule our race." There was silence for a time, but at length a great bear moved to the front and said, "I will fight him. I, Woof, the strongest of our race, and I will be king of the polar bears." The others nodded assent and dispatched a messenger to the king to say he must fight the great wolf and master him or resign his sovereignty. "For a bear with feathers," added the messenger, "is no bear at all, and the king we obey must resemble the rest of us." "I wear feathers because it pleases me," growled the king. "Am I not a great magician? But I will fight nevertheless, and if Wolf masters me, he shall be king in my stead." Then he visited his friends, the gulls, who were even then feasting upon the dead bear, and told them of the coming battle. "I shall conquer," he said proudly. "Yet my people are in the right, for only a hairy one like themselves can hope to command their obedience." The queen gull said, "I met an eagle yesterday, which had made its escape from a big city of men, and the eagle told me he had seen a monstrous polar bear skin thrown over the back of a carriage that rolled along the street. That skin must have been yours, O king, and if you wish I will send 100 of my gulls to the city to bring it back to you." "Let them go," said the king gruffly, and the 100 gulls were soon flying rapidly southward. For 3 days they flew straight as an arrow, until they came to scattered houses, to villages, and to cities. Then their search began. The gulls were brave and cunning and wise. Upon the 4th day they reached the great metropolis, and hovered over the streets until a carriage rolled along with a great white bear robe thrown over the back seat. Then the birds swooped down, the whole 100 of them, and seizing the skin in their beaks flew quickly away. They were late. The king's great battle was upon the 7th day, and they must fly swiftly to reach the polar regions by that time. Meanwhile, the bird bear was preparing for his fight. He sharpened his claws in the small crevasses of the ice. He caught a seal and tested his big yellow teeth by crunching its bones between them. And the queen gull set her band to pluming the king bear's feathers until they lay smoothly upon his body. But every day they cast anxious glances into the southern sky, watching for the 100 gulls to bring back the king's own skin. The 7th day came, and all the polar bears in that region gathered around the king's cavern. Among them was Woof, strong and confident of his success. "The bird bear's feathers will fly fast enough when I get my claws upon him," he boasted, and the others laughed and encouraged him. The king was disappointed at not having recovered his skin, but he resolved to fight bravely without it. He advanced from the opening of his cavern with a proud and kingly bearing, and when he faced his enemy, he gave so terrible a growl that Woof's heart stopped beating for a moment, and he began to realize that a fight with the wise and mighty king of his race was no laughing matter. After exchanging 1 or 2 heavy blows with his foe, Woof's courage returned, and he determined to dishearten his adversary by bluster. "Come nearer, bird bear," he cried. "Come nearer that I may pluck your plumage." The defiance filled the king with rage. He ruffled his feathers as a bird does, till he appeared to be twice his actual size, and then he strode forward and struck Woof so powerful a blow that his skull crackled like an eggshell and he fell prone upon the ground. While the assembled bears stood looking with fear and wonder at their fallen champion, the sky became darkened. 100 gulls flew down from above and dripped upon the king's body a skin covered with pure white hair that glittered in the sun like silver. And behold, the bears saw before them the well-known form of their wise and respected master, and with one accord they bowed their shaggy heads in homage to the mighty king of the polar bears. This story teaches us that true dignity and courage depend not upon outward appearance, but come rather from within. Also that brag and bluster are poor weapons to carry into battle. And now as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.